So our next speaker is Scot, Hovan, University of Minnesota, and I'm just going to warn the presenters, I'll change up my strategy a little bit. I'll give you a 2-minute signal, a 1-minute signal, and then I'll stand up when it's at 8 minutes. I think that's a little less.
Thank you for coming. My name is Scot Hovan, and I am a physics teacher at Matamita High School, which is outside of the Twin Cities. And I'm on sabbatical this year, working on my PhD at the University of Minnesota. I'm going to be talking today about my experience facilitating Discourse in the form of a whiteboard meeting. To give you a little bit of background though, I used the modeling instruction program from Arizona State University because I went to a workshop there in 2008, and I really found that the discourse management styles there were really attractive to me, and is something that I've been working on implementing in my own classroom. Today I'm going to be focusing on one particular genre of discourse called the whiteboard meeting, and basically at the start of each unit, groups work to conduct an experiment, and the variations are slight differences from one group to another. They draw up their findings on a whiteboard, and then we sit in a circle and have a conversation where we try to identify relationships of the variables that are explored in this experiment. And so we're trying to identify a model, trying to construct a model that will become the basis for this particular unit. Now, my own rationale for wanting to do this is because this approach of the whiteboard meeting is unfamiliar to most students. We don't raise our hands, we're sitting in a circle, and as a result, it's a little unfamiliar to them. And while we experienced these in the workshop at ASU, we didn't facilitate them from the role of the instructor. And so I really wanted to spend some time examining how I facilitated discourse in my own high school classroom. So to provide a framework, I'm using Mortimer and Scott's structure for that, in which there are 5 aspects of analysis. We look at the focus, the approach, and the action. And the tools that are here are to help analyze the way that a teacher's words and actions can help students construct meaning and develop the scientific story, the scientific view. The first thing would be teaching purposes. Am I trying to open up the problem? Are we exploring student views, that type of thing? When I look at the content, we're talking about the scientific language versus everyday language. We're talking about descriptions versus explanations versus generalizations for both a theoretical and an empirical approach. When we're talking about the communicative approach, we're talking about, are many students' ideas being heard, or is it one idea being heard? And likewise, is there one person speaking, or is it interactive? And then examining the patterns of discourse. Am I initiating some type of question to which a student responds, and then I evaluate, that IRE, triadic dialogue you probably have heard of? Or am I providing a follow-up move that encourages conversation? And then finally, when I do speak, are my teacher interventions, am I shaping an idea? Am I selecting an idea? Am I tagging or marking an idea as important? Am I helping share that idea? This is the type of thing that we're looking at. Now, to actually do the analysis, I use a software program called Transana, and it allows me to import video. It extracts a WAV file from that video, and then I can put in type codes that link the actual transcript to the audio file so that I can click and hear that portion of the dialogue to listen for inflections and things like that when I want to get into a deeper level of analysis. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at some of the findings. So in the teaching purpose, opening up the problem or exploring views and so forth, I noticed that, there seems to be a pretty good progression. We're starting off with the general opening up of the problem, and then we're getting to internalization and the applying of the scientific view, which is what we like. But I realized that there was a long period of time just opening up the problem. If you could see this timeline, you'd see that 10 minutes are where we really started getting into the heart of exploring student views and developing the scientific story. And I realized that it's because I wasn't giving them enough focus for the start of the conversation. I assumed that because of our worksheets and little presentations, that they knew when we had a graph, look at the shape, talk about the linear fit correlation, talk about the slope and the intercept, are they significant, what's the interpretation of that slope and so forth. It wasn't happening. So I need to be more deliberate and focusing, just like we did in the worksheets, in this conversation, talk about slope, correlation, shape, correlation, intercept, slope, that kind of thing. In looking at the content, I'm going to focus just on one dimension of that, and that's the social language. Bakhtin talks about the fact that science and many other things have their own language. We hear that today, and we'll hear that at this conference. But what's interesting is the proportion of scientific language versus the everyday colloquial language. And it helped me realize, wow, seeing it laid out like this, if I'm having a problem with students engaging in the conversation, it might not just be that they don't know about the phenomena, they might not have the words or understand how to use the words to describe or explain that phenomena. So I have to do, I think, what Lemke talks about, where I need to be more explicit in the teaching of this scientific language, and especially looking at semantic connections, because these words that might have one use in everyday language might have a very different use, and do have a very different use often in the scientific language. When I examined the communicative approach, I saw that there seemed to be a nice amount of interactivity, these two bars there. So I was really happy about that. You'll see that there is a balance between authoritative and the dialogic, because if we're trying to develop a scientific story, there's going to be the authoritative thing present. I was initially thought I wanted as much dialogic as possible, but we do want the students to learn the concept that the physics might be demonstrating. But what was interesting is I only had one small little piece where I kind of reviewed what students said. That's the non-interactive dialogic, and that was basically where I recap what the students did. So I think that having a large portion of that at the end would remind them of how they participated in the conversation and help them realize that they made a valuable contribution to the formation of that discussion. In looking at the patterns of discourse, here we talk about that initiation, response, and evaluation. I was a little discouraged in doing the analysis about how pervasive that triadic dialogue was. And I was happy with the fact in that magenta band here, that purple band, that there is follow-up moves. I was able to say, what do you mean? Tell me more about that. But I was still disappointed by how pervasive that triadic dialogue was. And there was really limited, these 3 bars are just student-to-student interactions. So I think that that would be a good area for me to focus on. I think that if I construct questions a little bit more carefully and deliberately, I'll be able to both reduce the pervasiveness of this triadic dialogue and also encourage then more student-to-student interactions. Finally, teacher interventions. What are the things that I'm saying actually doing? I think that this is a great way to show the complexity of teaching. Looking at this picture, seeing, am I shaping, selecting, marking, or sharing ideas? Am I checking, understanding, or reviewing? I think of this as it's almost like a dance of discourse, how everything we say does something. It's a little misleading, though, to see the checking, understanding. It looks really good, right? I'm checking all along the way, but in analyzing the transcript and the audio file, this is a little misleading because my question that was appearing 7 times in the first portion was, do you guys agree with that? And not many students are going to comfortably say, no, I really don't, or I have a question. So it was a little false. I think that what I really need to do is to ask more specific formative assessment questions that can really check for student understanding. So overall, I want to focus more at the start of the conversation, giving them help as to what to talk about so we can really spend more time on the meat. I want to make sure that I'm realizing that this is a different language for a lot of them. I want to make sure that students know their voices made this conversation with my recap, work on my question construction, and check for understanding by giving them opportunities to answer. Thank you.
Have time for a question or two?
Yeah, I just want to say that this is really impressive that you did such a careful analysis of your own teaching. And I was wondering, something that really stuck out to me is your analysis of the scientific and everyday language. And your sort of action item was to be more explicit about scientific language. And I wondered if you could say a little bit about what would that look like, being more explicit about scientific language?
Well, one of the things that Lemke talks about was the fact that we use language as scientists so casually that we don't always explain to students very much what seems repetitive to us, like talking about, velocity, find the velocity of that. I'm trying to figure out how quickly it changes position every second. So it's almost like you're using more basic colloquial terms to help get ingrained in the students what these scientific terms actually mean. So that's a very brief thing, but it's more along those lines. We do so much automatically as physics instructors that we just need to slow down and make sure that we're speaking in a way that they understand.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to move on. If there are questions, I'm sure you can ask.
Absolutely. I love it. Thanks.
The next speaker.